Good evening, and welcome to the Shadows. This is SL Tonight presents Tales That Terrify, Series 3. I'm your host, Felix Lubezki, and tonight we open the book that even Alfred Hitchcock said television was too timid to touch. Straight from the pages of 12 stories they wouldn't let me do on TV. Our first tale is Arthur Williams' Being a Murderer Myself. A cool, calm, first-person confession from a man who considers himself a perfectly civilized murderer. No gangsters, no monsters, just polite, wholesome mayhem, served with a side of chicken feet. Dim the lights, grab something stronger than popcorn. And remember, this one couldn't be done on TV, but it can be done right here, under the stars, at the SL Tonight studio. Being a murderer myself, I was very interested in the statement recently made by a well-known reviewer of murder stories that the best and most stimulating detective stories being written today are those that stress the puzzle of why, and at least co-equally with who and how. It is gratifying to see, even if it is only in the field of fiction, that the character of a murderer is at last being considered worthy of more detailed analysis. In the past, too much importance has been attached to discovering the identity of a murderer and the means of apprehending him. On the other hand, I do not consider wasting the time spent on the puzzle of how, since, after all, the method adopted is an indication of the type of man employing it. Furthermore, it often decides whether the killer is to become famous as a failure or unknown as a success. I would also like to mention that we murderers do not always make a mistake. That fallacy has arisen because only those murderers who have made mistakes ever come to the notice of the police. On the whole, we are very efficient, and taking the number of known cases only, it is evident that we have got away with many murders, in spite of the very large organizations directed against us. But the most common misconception held by most people is that a murderer is different from the ordinary man. Too often, he is described in exaggerated terms such as an insane monster or a cold-blooded brute. Such melodramatic ideas are far from the truth. Actually, a murderer is quite normal, merely possessing a greater courage to act on the universal conviction that the true golden rule is every man for himself. It is for this reason, therefore, to provide authentic data for the detective story writer that I have decided to make public my experience of murder. I have been fortunate in being so clever that I am able to relate this experience without fear of the unpleasant consequences. I feel no animosity towards Susan Braithwaite, personally, when I killed her, though some might consider that I had reason to hate her. I had been very fond of her once, and would have married her if she had not been so stupid as to choose Stanley Braithwaite for a husband. Still, I consider myself a civilized man of the world. I had felt that if she wanted to marry Moneybags, that was her own funeral. I suppose it was the feminine in her which had attracted me. That was in turn more attracted to the obvious maleness of Braithwaite, a great lout of a fellow, but with the right sort of brains to make his way in the world. He had inherited a little money, and being a city man, he was able to make the best use of it. He had made a fair income by dealing on the stock exchange, not by the haphazard methods of a gambler, but with the unspectacular method of the investor. It was typical of him that during the record boom on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, brought about by the discovery of gold in the Orange Free State, he continued his phlegmatic way of taking a profit as soon as a deal showed any, in spite of the fever of optimism that raged on the exchange. He was thus able to build up and consolidate a small fortune, and when the inevitable recession came, his funds were mostly liquid. Then, instead of being affected by the pervading depression, he quietly bought shares which had dropped to next to nothing, and so almost doubled his already swollen fortune when the equally inevitable recovery took place. An infuriating man. When I introduced him to Susan, she became greatly attracted by his masterful manner and the success which it spelled. In fact, she was carried away to such an extent that she flew to Europe with him, thus terminating our engagement. I had hoped never to see her again. 18 months later, on answering a knock at the back door of my house, I found Susan on the step, suitcase in hand. When she had comfortably settled herself on the Chesterfield couch in my study, she told me her story. I was not surprised at all at what she revealed. I could well imagine that Braithwaite's self-assured, dominant maleness, which she had preferred to my modest intellectual qualities, would develop into a complacent egoism, ruling with an efficient tyranny. When she could bear his insensitiveness no longer, she had walked out on him, and had come to me, where she felt that I would help her for old time's sake. She did not notice, however, that I was not enthusiastic at the prospect of helping her. Actually, I was highly displeased. After she had jilted me, I had worked her out of my system, at the same time making extensive improvements on my poultry farm. I had made the whole farm self-supporting, and with labor-saving devices and processes, was able to run the whole place single-handed, for I liked fowls and preferred to do all the work among them myself. But with Susan, it would have been difficult to continue in the same satisfying way. I knew I would have to entertain her, which meant that I would have had to shelve some of that less important, yet essential work. My routine would probably have gotten interfered with, and the 3,000 chickens, which were at the most awkward age, might have caught cold or contracted some other ailment they are susceptible to. Unfortunately, I could not think of any valid-sounding excuse for refusing to help her. Also, she had timed her arrival well. She would have had to stay the night at least, for there was no place in the village where she could have found accommodation, and there were no trains back to Johannesburg until the following morning. I knew that once the ice had been broken by letting her stay the night, it would have been even more difficult to send her away the next day. After all, I had once been very fond of her, and during the delirium of that time, I had told her that no matter what ultimately happened between us, if she was ever in trouble, she was to count on my help. And as I pride myself on being a man of my word, I could not bear to think of her telling our common friends that in an emergency I proved to be in a broken reed. All this passed through my mind while she chattered away about the cruel things her husband had done to her, but under the pretense of listening, I followed the trend of my own thoughts until I became annoyed at the calm way she took my sympathy for granted. From the bits of her conversation I did listen to, I guessed in what manner she wished me to help her, and my annoyance mounted. I saw my little bit of money being spent on lawyers, my comfortable and satisfying life being disturbed, my future peace being threatened by complicated emotions. In short, the whole of my nicely settled life being completely upset. I became so enraged that I thought, really, I could wring her neck. The actual strangling was far more difficult than one would have thought, but the inability to face her, which had led me to go around the back of the couch to get my hands around her throat, turned out to be an advantage. For by crouching behind the back of the couch, I was able to press her neck and head firmly against it, and so, by hanging on like grim death, avoid my hands becoming dislodged by her violent kicking, hitting, and threshing for air. Also, when she went limp, I was in a comfortable enough position not to need to relax till I was sure she was dead. Her face, dark blue with grotesquely protruding tongue, was rather shocking when contrasted with the pretty animated expression it had had a few minutes before, and her once glossy hair seemed to have lost its blue tints and had become a lifeless-looking black. Otherwise, the sight of Susan's body did not affect me much. After making sure that Susan was dead, I pushed her tongue back in her mouth and proceeded to dispose of the body in the manner I had been stimulated to devise when reading of the difficulties other murderers had experienced in this respect. I started the process that night, for though there was no urgency, as it would be days or even weeks before there would be any serious inquiry as to Susan's whereabouts, I was keen on putting my idea to the test. The following morning I was up early as usual and busy at my farm routine. One afternoon, about 3 weeks later, Sergeant Theron of the local police turned up at my place and wanted to know if I knew anything about a Miss Braithwaite. Sergeant John Theron on duty was a different man from the off-duty Johnny Theron, who occasionally, when suitably warmed, entertained us in the backyard of Wicked's pub by giving a demonstration of Wild West six-shooting. He was a crack shot, and crouching slightly, he would fire 2 guns from the hip with amazing accuracy, at the same time looking from side to side with melodramatic belligerency. Then, after each salvo, he would spit on the muzzles of the revolvers to "fool" them, giving a thigh-slappingly funny impression of a cowboy hero surrounded by dastardly villains. But Sergeant John Theron of the South African Police was an alert and intelligent policeman who took his work seriously. And I knew by the way his question was worded that he was sure I did know something about Miss Braithwaite. I guessed that she had been reported missing and had been traced to my farm. I decided, therefore, to take Theron into my confidence. I told him briefly all about my association with Susan in the past, winding up by telling him that she'd been to see me one evening about 3 weeks before, but that she'd left again on the same night. He naturally wanted further particulars, and also wanted to know why I had not come forward and reported to the police that I'd seen her at a time later than which the newspaper appeal had stated was the last time she'd been seen. I explained that I never read newspapers, but even if I had read the appeal for information, I would not have reported her visit as she'd been running away from her husband. I went on to tell him that she had wanted me to help her, but that I had refused, that we had quarreled till she had finally gotten in such a rage that she had walked out of the house, leaving her hat, gloves, and suitcase behind. In reply to his questions, I said that I did not know where she had gone, or how she intended to manage without her suitcase, or whether she had a handbag with her or not. After exhausting the subject of Susan's visit, Theron asked to see her suitcase. I gave it to him. He found it unlocked and opened it. On top was a brown handbag, which, on being turned out, was found to contain some money, a pair of earrings, a pearl necklace, a diamond ring, the usual feminine requirements, and a few loose keys, one of which fitted the suitcase. After carefully examining the rest of the suitcase contents, Theron then asked me what Miss Braithwaite had been wearing that night. That question had come sooner than I had expected, but I gave him the previously thought-out answer, which was a genuine-sounding, yet worthlessly vague description of the clothes I had carefully packed together with the handbag in the suitcase 3 weeks before. I had opened the case with one of the keys I had found in the handbag. I had had to leave the suitcase unlocked as I did not want the problem of disposing of the key. Incidentally, I had done the packing of the clothes, shoes, etc. while wearing gloves. I had no intention of leaving fingerprints inside the case, and so making the traditional mistake. Theron listened closely to the description, and then pulled out the one dress in the suitcase which had obviously been worn, and asked me if that had been the dress Miss Braithwaite had worn that evening. Of course, I replied that it was not, but I knew that if that dress had already been described by anyone who had seen Susan going to my farm, that description would be more or less the same as the one I had given. After asking a few more unimportant questions, Sergeant Theron left, taking the suitcase, the hat, and gloves with him. The police did not visit me again for a few days. I went to the village for a drink on the evening of the week that Johnny Theron usually spent at the pub, but he did not put in an appearance that night. But I knew that it would only be a matter of time before I saw him again, for Susan's trail definitely ended at my place, and the police would concentrate there until they had reason to look elsewhere. When Theron eventually came again, about a week later, he was accompanied by Constable Barry, a prematurely bald young man who had wooed and won the village belle, Renee Otto, by so maneuvering his quartering that she never saw him without his helmet on, so the story went in the village anyway. In charge of both Theron and Barry, however, was a man from the CID headquarters in Johannesburg. This time the only words Sergeant Thorne spoke throughout the morning were, "Mr. Williams, this is Inspector Ben Liebenberg." I acknowledged the introduction and asked the inspector what I could do for him. He was a tall, handsome man, more like an actor than a detective. Afterwards, I learned that he was a good mixer of drinks. His hobby was inventing new recipes for cocktails and other mixed drinks. I was told this and about his variation of a green mamba, which is as deadly as a snake, by Theron later when he was able to drink with me again. Inspector Liebenberg professed himself sorry to trouble me, but would I mind if he'd had to look around? Miss Braithwaite had definitely been seen coming to my place and had equally definitely not been seen anywhere else, so he would like to satisfy himself that she was not hiding somewhere on my farm. I assured him that I understood and that it would be a pleasure to show him over the farm. As we examined the homestead, I explained to them that I liked to be independent of any house outside assistance, so I'd made my house and farm as self-contained as possible. I showed them the coal bin in the kitchen, built like a small room and filled at the top from the outside, having a little square outlet flush with the floor, next to the coal-burning stove. Below the kitchen there was a concrete underground tank for storing rainwater. It had a hand pump attached, and pipes were laying from the bathroom. The rest of my domestic water supply came from a large gravity tank on the roof, filled by a wind pump from a borehole. I started the tour outside by taking him to the 300 feet long, subdivided, intensive type poultry house, where, judging by the sound, the thousands of leghorn hens were riveting their eggs together. I showed the policeman the incubator room and the brooder house, which I also used for experimental batches of chicken and fowls. I then took them to the large corrugated iron barn, which housed my machinery, a tractor, a threshing machine, a hammer mill, and various smaller machines such as lucerne cutters, etc. Also my general farm equipment such as plows, harrows, a steam drying tank, planters, cultivators, etc., and my stocks of food. Around the sides of the barn were rows of large storage tanks, variously containing whole and crushed maize, maize meal, meat meal, peanut meal, bone meal, lucerne meal, and the various other poultry and animal feed requirements I use for making up the different balanced ration. And there's shrimp, and then there's bubblegum shrimp. Oh, anyway. I could see the eyes measuring the tanks and the jotting down of the copious mental notes. In the open air again, I pointed out my cultivated lands. The lucerne fields green, owing to the water from the dam, but the maize and other lands a yellowy brown. In the distance we could just make out the few cows, oxen, and horses grazing on the uncultivated part of my farm. When they had seen the whole farm, Inspector Liebenberg thanked me for my trouble and departed rather depressed. I thought. I would have liked to suggest that perhaps 20 maids with 20 mops, but decided that it was unwise to trade on my security too much. A week passed without event, though I began to get irritated by being under continuous surveillance. Even Constable Barry had altered his beat so that he was able to pass my gate, which, though a fair distance from the homestead, enabled him to have a clear view across the lawns to the house and the garage. I decided to make a move and bring matters to a climax. My best plan, of course, was to make Cribben's mistake and run away. I therefore made preparations, and early one morning I departed in my car at high speed. I drove fast for about 5 miles, and then abruptly slowed down, headed the car into the veld, and hid it as much as possible in a bushy bit, well away from the road. I walked the rest of the way to the underground caves not far from the famous Bleivortrovitz gold mine. These caves, though not expensive, are not beautiful and do not attract many visitors. I had decided that the police would already have searched them thoroughly, so the chances that were there that I'd be undisturbed. I had brought a Coleman lamp, a camp primus, and ample provisions, and soon settled comfortably in one of the smaller cabins. I knew the fowls on the farm would be alright for a few days, as their food troughs held enough for about 3 days, and the water troughs with their ball valves would remain full. The eggs would accumulate in the batteries of nests and ultimately make a mess, but one cannot have murder without breaking eggs. The other animals would not starve, and there was plenty of water lying about the place. The chickens were then old enough to do without artificial heat for warmth, only requiring small economical growth from the lamps to collect them in groups at night. So, with my mind at peace, I was able to relax and enjoy the 2 detective books which I had brought with me. Stories were very good, though I noticed, with satisfaction, that the various detectives required considerable assistance from their authors. On the morning of the 3rd day, I imagined that things should be about right for me to put it in an appearance again. As luck would have it, it was Sergeant Theron who met me first when I stepped out of the car in front of my house. The human face is not designed to express amazement, excitement, satisfaction, curiosity, wonder, relief, official reserve, friendliness, and regret all at once, but Theron's did its best. When he recovered, he demanded to know where I had been. I told him that I had gone to the caves to see if Miss Braithwaite had not perhaps gone there and gotten lost and died there, and that I had become lost myself and had found my way out only that morning. He snapped his fingers in aspiration, and I guessed that he'd spread his net far and wide, but had not thought of looking for me so close at hand. While he was thinking what he ought to do next, I looked around to get details of the impression of an upturned ant heap which I had received when I drove up. I expected to see signs of activity, but nothing like what I saw then. Evidently, the police had decided to use more than 20 maids, for the place was in a turmoil. There were men everywhere, on the roof of the house, round the house, half under the house. There were men walking about with heads bent examining the ground, men digging at various places, men around the dam, round the borehole, in the fields, and on the lands. I could not see into the barn, but it must have been full of men, for outside the main double doors a collection of agricultural hardware was scattered like the throwback of a burrowing terrier. But the most joyous sight was the long hen house. The hens had, very unwisely, all been chased outside so that the concrete floor inside could be examined. To lay the floor bare, a 6-inch layer of manured straw had first to be removed. This considerable task had already been mostly achieved, for the straw lay in large mounds outside, in front of the entrance doors. Along the outside of the poultry house there were men trying to uncover the foundations, for whoever was in charge of the searching meant to leave no stone unturned. I write trying, advisedly, for the diggers were being considerably hampered by the thousands of hens who had no place to go, but who were trying, with hen-like persistence, to go back where they belonged. Hens are very conservative, besides they had eggs to lay. There was a precarious and continual changing line of them along the narrow ledge between the mesh wire front of the house and the edge of the low front wall of which the wire front wested. And this was one of the walls, that foundations of which the men were hoping to examine. They were almost smothered in hens. When it wasn't hens, it was dust and dirt. A leghorn is a very highly strung bird, jumpy at the best of times. With leghorns, you have to keep up continual chatter or be forever silent. While I was watching, one of the men digging had to reply to a call from a distant policeman. The sudden shouted answer resulted in thousands of hens leaping in the air as one bird, with literally a roaring of wings. The men became lost to view in a cloud consisting of a mixture of fine particles of manure, straw, earth, spilled food, and down. I was not able to see more, for by then Theron had decided that I had better come along with him to the police station to answer some questions. At the station I was left in charge of Constable Herndal, who received my nod of recognition rigidly. After a short delay, Theron started questioning me, trying hard to give the impression that he did not attach much importance to my answers. I was halfway through my 3rd cigarette when a constable burst through into the room and shouted, "We found the body!" I jumped up and explained, "How exciting! Where?" A remark thoroughly in bad taste, considering that I had known Miss Braithwaite well, but one that could not be interpreted as coming from a guilty and apprehensive mind. I turned to Theron, who had been watching me closely, and saw doubt in his eyes. Not that it mattered whether I betrayed guilt or not. I was perfectly safe and could never give myself away no matter what trick they tried. but if I'd shown any signs of a guilty conscience, Theron would have known definitely that I was a murderer. This I wanted to avoid, or there would not have been much future pleasure in visiting the pub. I did not mind his official suspicion, but his private certainty would have been different. Theron continued the farce and also asked the constable where the body had been found. The latter went on with less enthusiasm to describe vaguely some spot in the uncultivated land. They both looked at me with a last hope that I might indicate they were getting warm. I said, "Fancy, I wouldn't have thought that was a good place to bury a body. This means that she was murdered, doesn't it?" Of course, they never found Susan's body on my farm, or anywhere else, or any trace of it. They examined the stove for any signs of human ash. They swept the chimney for the same purpose. They dug up the drains to see if I had possibly dissolved the body in a bath of chemicals. In short, they looked everywhere and tried every box of tricks possessed by the Johannesburg CID, all to no avail. Finally, they had to give up, baffled. No matter how much they suspected that Susan had been murdered, they had no proof. In spite of the most thorough search of my farm, no body was found, and this fact, plus no obvious motive on my part, resulted in the cloud of suspicion hanging over my head gradually becoming dispersed. That Christmas, to show that there was no ill feeling, I sent Sergeant Theron a brace of cockerels. The months passed in uninterrupted peace. My content was marred only by the news that Sergeant Theron was leaving to join the Rhodesian police. We gave him a fine farewell party, Bill Wiggins providing the drinks, while I contributed the poultry. Poor Johnny was not able to give us the last demonstration of six-shooting that night, for when we went out into the yard, the fresh air had a bad effect on him, and it took him all his time to stay relatively upright, hanging on to the swaying washing line. The building of a new brooder house began to occupy all my thoughts, but doing it by myself took all my time, with the result that I could not keep my house clean and tidy. So after much indecision, I engaged a housekeeper, a blonde, tall, but giving the impression of childlike plumpness. She is most efficient, yet her warm smile suggests that she could be very kind and affectionate. It is because she runs the house so well that I now have time in the evening to write this record of my experience with homicide. I am looking forward to having an interesting time should I get this published. I am particularly curious about Theron's reaction should he read this and so learn the makeup and constitution of those plump chickens he so enjoyed. I suppose he'll be disgusted, though he need not be. After all, how was he to know that those chickens had been feeding on the body of Susan Braithwaite? I do not mean by crudely pecking at it. On the contrary, the fowls ate Susan in a well-balanced ration. Every bit of her body had been through the hammer mill to be ground into fine bone meal and meat meal. A separate process made blood meal. These processes entailed no difficulty, as I had learned how to do it from an article in the Farmer's Magazine, and been doing it with animal carcasses long before. And as far as the hammer mill process is concerned, human bodies, not requiring to be skinned and having smaller bones, are more easier to manage. I had only to take extra care that every single piece of her body was powdered. Teeth I had to put through the milling process a couple of times so they became indistinguishable from the rest of the bone meal. The hair I burned on the head, making a sort of charcoal. After I had processed the body, I had wiped everything that it had touched with handfuls of green lucerne, which in turn was ground fine. Animal carcasses were then put through the mill, followed by heaps of lucerne and bags of maize, so that all traces of human cells were completely removed from the machine. The meat meal, bone meal, and blood meal were made into ration with other foodstuffs and were fed to my experimental batch of chicks. What fine chicks they grew into, as Theron can testify. As a matter of fact, I have established quite a reputation for fine pullets and cockerels, and other poultry farmers have pestered me for the recipe of my balanced ration. This will surely be brought to the attention of Inspector Lineberg, who, now knowing where to look, may try to find some proof that there was once a human body on my farm, but I am certain he will not succeed. It will be no use slaughtering fowls wholesale in an attempt to find the ones that have partaken of Susan, with the object of testing them for any traces of human cells in their makeup. I have seen to it that every fowl that shared that human ration has itself been consumed by other humans. As people do not eat the bones of fowls, I made a point of selling, or giving the dressed fowls only on condition that I was allowed to collect the bones afterward. My explanation of this was that I was short of bone meal. These bones then went to the mill with other bones. Nice example of ad infinitum. Also, there are a large number of anonymous people who, in a remoter degree, took part in this deplorable cannibalism. I mean, those who ate the eggs that were laid by the hens. Then Inspector Leinberg will no doubt think of the manure. I wouldn't bother if I were he. Every bit of it has been spread over my uncultivated land and thoroughly plowed in. Alas for the inspector, the plucked udders, heads, legs, feet, and innards of the dressed fowls sold or given away after being burned or steamed dry also did not escape a hammering from the relentless mill. I hope the good inspector is not driven to trying to make this story of mine have the value of a legal confession. It'd be a great pity if an ardent student of detective fiction, desirous of seeing a story of his own published, should be arrested because he invented a feasible explanation to account for the disappearance of a woman he happened to know. I suppose I must also expect a certain amount of unpleasantness if this is read in our village. Some narrow-minded people will no doubt look upon me with horror, and others will fear me. Since the main result of such attitudes will be that I shall no longer be pestered by casual callers, I shall be only too pleased. A new development has occurred. The housekeeper, and listen, may turn out to be a disappointment after all. She is evidently falling, or has already fallen, in love with me and is becoming tiresome. Her solicitude on my behalf is overwhelming, and I now seem to have no privacy left, for she is always fussing about doing things to add to my comfort. I would not like to hurt her feelings by telling her to stop doing what she does out of the kindness of her heart, and as she has no technical qualifications, it'd be a shame to send her away to battle for a job again. I have suggested to her that she should go out more, especially in the evenings, but she said it was dull going out alone. She has no friends, or even relations. Poor thing, she has no one to miss her, and I'm most eager to rear especially good stock next season, fed with rich and well-balanced rations. The president of the National Poultry Society has expressed a desire to see my farm and the fine pullets and cockerels for which I am now so justly famous. And there you have it. The perfect crime. Until the chickens start laying unusually fine eggs. Hitchcock was right. Some stories are simply too grotesque for the home screen. Here at SL Tonight, we don't flinch. We serve them straight. Virginia Leif gave us a living head. Now Arthur Williams gives us a living head, ground into balanced ration. Next week, we descend even deeper with... Until then, like, comment, subscribe. This has been SL Tonight Presents Tales That Terrify. We are where the nightmares go. Welcome back. And good night. And good hunting.